Welcome to Squarebox Games How to Play. I'm Tanner, and today we're going to be playing Nyctophobia, a game by Catherine Steipel. Now, before we get started, let's talk a minute about the setting of this game, written by the game author. The night is cold and dark. It's hard to see where you are or where you've been. A road trip gone awry is a charitable description of the world you and your friends find yourself trapped in. No one will ever believe you. Vampires aren't real, right? Well, tell that to the bloodsucker that's been hunting you. Tell that to your friend who wandered off into the forest with him. The game is played with 3 to 5 players, where one player kind of acts as the game runner, but also plays as the vampire. There are 2 separate win conditions, one for the hunted, or the players, and another for the vampire. The players win if they're able to get the familiar, their friend that wandered into the woods, back to the car, where is basically where they started. The vampire wins when the first player loses both of their health tokens. Once one player loses, game's over, vampire wins. So the box states that the game will last somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. Now, in my experience playing this, that can widely range depending on how new you are to the game or, how much fun you want to have with it. As far as complexity goes of the game, I kind of give it a 4.5 out of 10. If 1 was like Chutes and Ladders and 10 was Dungeons and Dragons, it kind of falls in that mid-range. Pretty much the whole family can play this and latch onto the instructions pretty easily. So when you first get your copy of Nyctophobia, when you open the box, what you'll find in here is the game board. It's 8x8 grid. You'll find all of the tree pieces. You'll find little compass icons. You've got your vampire movement deck. We'll get into that a little bit later. Health tokens, rock tokens, a sound token, a wound token, and your characters here, which we'll get into that a little bit later as well, and class cards, along with the blackout glasses. Can't see a thing in these. Your players are going to be completely blind the entire game. So the next thing to do is to actually set up the board. Tell your hunted to either put on the glasses or just leave the room completely for now. You'll start with your 8x8 grid here and all of your tree pieces. Now, if you're new to the game, in the back of the instruction manual are a couple suggested layouts that I would suggest doing your first couple playthroughs. After that, get creative, go nuts. But once you finish, be sure to cover the board with the box top and welcome your players back to the Forest of the Vampire. Now, with your players being blind the whole time, most board games you can just see your character on the board. However, on this one, it's very tactile based. So have each of your players pick one of your characters and have them get a feel for it. Have them know which one is there so they'll be able to recognize it just by touch. After each of your hunted players pick a character token, they also have a class to choose. This will enable them to have certain perks throughout the game. So to set up for turn 1, have all of your hunted players be within arm's reach of the board. It's super important, obviously, they're blind, they've got to be able to reach the board and feel around. Now, the vampire doesn't have a specific place to be. In fact, it's actually more beneficial for the vampire to kind of work the room, go around, scare your players if they're getting kind of freaked out. You're running the game. You're in charge of making sure that your players are having a good time. And part of that is also, if they're not doing so well on feeling around and they're not getting anywhere close to the familiar, as the vampire, take your own liberties. If you feel like, maybe you'll kill them too fast, fudge some rules a little bit. Maybe move away from the player instead of moving toward them. Have fun with it. It's not all about following every rule strictly. So let's talk a minute about hunted movement. The movement is kind of split into 2 different phases. You've got searching and then the actual movement. In the searching part, each player will put their finger on the piece guided to them by the vampire, because obviously they're blind, and then they can feel in each of the cardinal directions. They may not feel diagonally. After the player has made a decision on where they want to go, they move in that direction, and then they have the option to move to search again or just move again. Now, be careful with that. You don't want to move too much. You don't want to feel too much, because then you'll get into combat, and we'll talk about that later, but just trust me, it's not good for you. Now, if you run into a tree, the player cannot feel past the tree. Now, as the vampire, you let them know, like, hey, there's a tree right there. You can't feel past that. You know, in games past, I've had people reach past and not realize there's a tree. I'm like, hey, no, don't do that. So just be paying attention to the game and make sure that everyone's having a good time. So either before or after your movement, but not during, you can do one of 4 actions. You can either sprint, you can leave the familiar on the space you're occupying, you can hide, or you can throw a rock. So sprint means that you can actually take 1 extra movement space as well. But again, be careful. You don't want to feel around too much. Could be risky. The second action is you can actually leave the familiar. If you're carrying the familiar and you choose to leave it, like maybe the vampire's chasing you, yada yada, you don't want to put that character in harm's way, you can actually leave the familiar on the space that you just left. The third action is actually hide. Now this one's an interesting one. What you do there is you would turn your piece upside down, and then you're not allowed to talk until your next turn. So you're hidden, the vampire can't hit you, you can't get into combat. The vampire, if he's trailing you, doesn't know you're there anymore if you do the hide action. However, you can't talk anymore. Communication in this game is actually very, very important. You as the players have to work together and communicate with each other in order to succeed. You kind of have to work together to paint a picture of the board. Really a memory test. So focus on that communication, remember where things are, key points. Hey, the vampire's 3 spaces away from me. 2 turns ago, I was right next to you. Be careful. So the last action that you can do is actually throw a rock. Now, if you remember at the beginning of the game, each player got a rock token. You have that one to start with. In addition, they're also scattered around the board during the setup. If you run into one, you pick it up, it's added to your inventory. Great. Now, as an action, you can choose to throw your rock. Now, it goes until it hits something. So you would announce which direction you want to throw it in, and the vampire would tell you what it hit. If it hits another player, that player takes damage, just like if the vampire hit it. If it hits the vampire is wounded for a turn, and it reduces the amount of movement that the vampire can do. If it hits a tree, it just stops, but at any point when it stops, you actually put the sound token on that spot. Now, a little bit about the sound token. Before we get into the vampire movement, the sound token is something that, as the hunted players, you'll really want to use to your advantage. Normally, the vampire has to make his move to the nearest player piece. However, if the noise token is in play, the vampire then alters his course and goes toward the sound token instead of the player. So as you can see, it can really be an advantage for the hunted. But if you play it wrong, you're dead. So now a little bit about the vampire movement. The vampire actually moves with this deck of cards here. At the beginning of the vampire turn, you'll actually draw 2 cards, and you'll pick one of them to act as your vampire movement. Now, like I said before, the vampire has to move to the nearest player. If it's a tie, up to you. You get to pick whoever you don't like. Now, here's the kicker. Right when the hunted find the familiar and pick it up, that's when the intensity part of the vampire cards kick in. The vampire then becomes a lot harder to dodge. So, the combat. Yes, you will end up fighting the vampire. It's inevitable. Now, you do want to limit that as much as you can, because if one player loses all of his or her health, the game's over. The vampire wins, and you all die. And I definitely wouldn't recommend going after the vampire. Compared to him, you're basically a box of tissues. So, don't do that. So, combat is triggered at any point on your player's turn if you ever make physical contact with the vampire. So during your searching phase, that's why I told you to be very careful during your searching phase. If at any point you make contact with the vampire, it immediately starts combat. Now, the order of combat goes as follows. Immediately, right when combat starts, you lose one of your 2 health. Every time. You can't stop it. After that, you have the option, if you have a rock, to counterattack. Now, with a counterattack, what will happen there is the vampire will then move away 2 spaces in the direction that they were attacking you from, and the vampire then gets the wound token, which, as I stated earlier, will crippled the vampire just a little bit, basically reduces its movement down by 1. The next part is the retreat phase, and an optional hide actually. So after the counterattack, if you choose to counterattack, you can do a retreat move, meaning you can move away 2 spaces following the same searching and movement rules as your normal turn. And when you get to the end of your retreat, you have the option to turn over your piece and hide. Now, this can be a give or take, because sometimes, you want to explain to your teammates where the vampire is, because it could be right next to them. So, maybe it's not always the best idea to hide, maybe it's a great idea. I'll let you figure that out for yourself. And then the last step of combat is actually the reset phase. This one's pretty straightforward. If there's a noise token on the board, no matter if it had to do with the combat or not, you remove the noise token and play continues. So now that we've kind of covered all the basic rules of combat, movement, of both sides, the vampire and the hunted, you keep doing that until either the hunted get the familiar back to the car, or the vampire kills one player. Whichever comes first, we'll see who wins. So Nyctophobia is one of the most unique games that I've seen really ever. Most board games are so focused on sight. For this game to completely strip away your sight and you're focusing entirely on your speech, your hearing, and your touch primarily, it gives it a really interesting concept, and frankly has a ton of replayability to it, because even if your players look at the board when the game's over, you could use the exact same layout, and I'd be willing to bet they don't remember where the pieces are. Overall, I give this game honestly an 8.5 out of 10. I bring this game to any board game night, and everyone that I play with always has fun with it. It just spices it up. It changes it up past the normal, card games and moving around a board and stuff like that. So, highly recommend it. Hey y'all, thanks for watching. We here at Squarebox Games put a lot of time and effort into these videos, and we would really appreciate it if you left us a like, hit the subscribe button, and just rub that little bell icon so you know when we upload our next video. But until then, watch out for vampires.